Barren Cowboy Dreams. Josie Callahan had always done as she was told, right up until Rhett Slade stormed into her wedding and carried her off on horseback. The groom lay stunned, and Rhett? He just grinned, his grip firm around her waist. "You were never meant for him, sweetheart," he murmured. "You've always been mine." Chapter 1. The uninvited guest's arrival. The church bell, meant to peal with joyous abandon, felt more like a death knell to Josie Callahan. Each clang resonated with the finality of a closing door, a door shutting on the life she'd always known, however predictable and empty it had been. The scent of lilies, normally so sweet, was cloying, suffocating. She adjusted the ivory lace of her gown, the fabric feeling stiff and foreign against her skin, much like the unfamiliar role she was about to play. Mrs. Arthur Pemberton. Arthur. A good man, everyone said. Steady. Reliable. He owned the largest dry goods store in Harmony Creek, a town that was slowly, inexorably, drying up itself, both literally and figuratively. Josie looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror hanging in the vestry. Her reflection stared back, a woman of 57, her auburn hair, streaked with silver, pulled back tightly in a bun that felt as constricting as her corset. The fine lines around her hazel eyes spoke of years spent under the relentless Texas sun, years of quiet resignation, of dreams deferred and eventually forgotten. She wasn't beautiful, not anymore, but there was a lingering strength in her features, a resilience that even this ill-fitting gown couldn't entirely conceal. She'd agreed to this marriage out of a sense of duty. After her father, a stubborn, weathered rancher, had passed away last year, leaving her with little more than a failing ranch and a mountain of debt, Arthur had been a lifeline. A practical solution. A way to keep the Callahan name, the Callahan land, from slipping away entirely. Love? That was a foolish girl's dream, a luxury she'd long ago learned to live without. Her heart, she told herself, was as barren as the drought-stricken fields surrounding Harmony Creek. The organ music swelled, signaling her cue. Her brother, Thomas, younger by 10 years, stood at the door, his face a mixture of relief and pity. He offered his arm, his grip firm, almost desperate. He'd never approved of Arthur, always sensing, perhaps, Josie's lack of genuine affection. But Thomas, burdened with his own family and a struggling farm, couldn't offer an alternative. So he'd stood by, silently, as Josie made her choice. "Ready, Joe?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, a tight, almost imperceptible movement. "As I'll ever be." The walk down the aisle felt interminable. The faces of the townsfolk blurred, a sea of well-wishers and curious onlookers. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, perhaps even envying her good fortune. Arthur stood at the altar, his round face flushed, his neatly trimmed mustache quivering slightly. He looked expectant, and Josie felt nothing. Nothing but a hollow ache in the place where her heart used to beat with a youthful fervor. The preacher, a gaunt man with a voice that droned on like the endless prairie wind, began the ceremony. His words, meant to sanctify and unite, washed over Josie without meaning. She repeated the vows mechanically, her voice barely a whisper. To have and to hold. From this day forward suddenly, a commotion erupted at the back of the church. A gasp rippled through the congregation. The organ music faltered, then stopped altogether. Josie turned, her heart lurching with a sudden, inexplicable jolt of something. Of fear? Anticipation? Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh midday sun, stood a figure straight out of the legends her father used to tell. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to burn with an intensity that could ignite the very air. He wore dusty riding clothes, a gun belt slung low on his hips, and a look of such fierce determination that it stole the breath from her lungs. It was Rhett Slade. The name exploded in her mind like a gunshot. A name whispered in hushed tones, a name associated with danger, with rebellion, with a past she'd tried desperately to bury. A name linked to the one youthful indiscretion, the one fiery passion that had threatened to consume her all those years ago. He moved with a predatory grace, his spurs clicking on the wooden floor, each step echoing the thudding of her heart. The crowd parted before him, like the Red Sea before Moses, their murmurs turning into stunned silence. Arthur, his face now a mask of bewildered outrage, stepped forward. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered. Red ignored him. His gaze was fixed solely on Josie, unwavering, possessive. He reached her in a few long strides, his eyes, the color of the stormy Texas sky, locking onto hers. "Josie," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent shivers down her spine, a voice she hadn't heard in over 30 years, yet it was as familiar as her own breath. "You weren't ever meant for him." Before Arthur or anyone else could react, Rhett swept her up into his arms, as easily as if she were a feather. The lilies scattered, their cloying scent replaced by the earthy aroma of leather, sweat, and something wilder, something untamed. He turned, his grip firm around her waist, his body heat radiating through the layers of her wedding gown. "You've always been mine," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. The words a shocking declaration, a promise, and a threat all rolled into one. He carried her out of the church, into the blinding sunlight, the stunned silence of the congregation broken only by the frantic whinny of a horse. She saw it then, a magnificent black stallion, pawing the ground impatiently, its reins held by a young man with the same stormy eyes as Rhett. His son, perhaps? Arthur's shout, a strangled cry of protest, faded behind them as Rhett mounted the stallion in one fluid motion, pulling Josie up behind him. She clung to him, her body pressed against his, the hard muscles of his back a stark contrast to the soft, yielding form of the man she'd almost married. As they galloped away, leaving Harmony Creek and her carefully constructed life in the dust, Josie looked back. She saw Arthur, a small, deflated figure standing amidst the chaos, his dreams, like hers, shattered on the floor of the church. And for the first time in a long time, Josie Callahan felt alive. But was this life, this sudden, violent upheaval, a liberation or another form of captivity? The wind whipped through her hair, tearing away the carefully constructed bun, the silver strands mingling with the auburn, a symbol, perhaps, of the past and the present colliding. The vast, open prairie stretched before them, unforgiving and beautiful, a mirror of the uncertain future that lay ahead. The only certainty was the man holding her, the man who had stolen her away, the man who claimed she was his. And as she felt the rhythmic pounding of the horses' hooves beneath them, a question, sharp and insistent, pierced through the fear and exhilaration. What had she gotten herself into? Chapter 2. Across the whispering plains. The wind, a relentless sculptor of the landscape, tore at Josie's hair, whipping the loosened strands across her face. She tasted dust and the faint, metallic tang of fear. The rhythmic pounding of the stallion's hooves was a drumbeat against the silence of the vast plains, a silence broken only by the creak of leather and Rhett's occasional, low-spoken commands to the horse. He rode with an effortless grace, a natural extension of the powerful animal beneath them, a stark contrast to the stiff, awkward gait of the buggy horses she was accustomed to. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd swept her out of the church, her mind reeling, her body numb with shock. The audacity of his actions, the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it all, left her speechless. And yet, beneath the fear and confusion, a flicker of something else excitement was undeniably present. It was the same reckless thrill she'd felt all those years ago, the thrill that had led her down a path she'd spent decades trying to forget. She glanced at his profile, etched against the vast, azure canvas of the sky. The years had been kind to him in their own way. The lines around his eyes, deeper now, spoke of hardship, of a life lived on the edge, but they hadn't diminished the intensity of his gaze, the raw power that emanated from him. His jaw was set, his lips pressed into a thin line, his focus entirely on the horizon. He hadn't looked at her, not since that initial, searing gaze in the church. Where are you taking me?" She finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse and unsteady. He didn't answer immediately, the silence stretching out, punctuated only by the wind's mournful whisper. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a murmur, as if speaking to himself as much as to her. "Home," he said simply. The word, so ordinary, yet so loaded with meaning, sent a fresh wave of unease through her. Home. For Rhett Slade, she knew, that word likely held a very different connotation than it did for her. Home for her had always been the Callahan Ranch, a place of hard work and quiet desperation, a place she was now being dragged away from, perhaps forever. Home for him, what was it? A hidden outlaw camp? A rundown shack in the middle of nowhere? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She stole another glance at him. The hard planes of his face were softened by the golden light of the setting sun. He looked tired. There was a weariness in his posture, a subtle slump of his shoulders, that belied the fierce energy he displayed earlier. The hand holding the reins, though strong and calloused, trembled slightly. She wondered about the life he'd lived, the choices he'd made, the burdens he carried. The landscape began to change, the flat, monotonous plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional, gnarled mesquite tree. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They were heading towards the foothills, towards the wilder, more untamed regions of the territory. "Rhett," she said, her voice firmer this time, "you can't just kidnap me." "Arthur Hill, send the sheriff." Hill. He finally turned his head, his eyes, dark and unreadable, meeting hers. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch in her throat. "Arthur," he said, his voice laced with a scorn that made her flinch, "is a fool. And he won't find you. Not where we're going." "And where is that?" she challenged, her fear giving way to a flicker of defiance. She was, after all, a Callahan. They were known for their stubbornness, their resilience, their refusal to be broken. He smiled then, a slow, crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a smile that hinted at danger, at secrets, at a world she knew nothing about. "You'll see," he said. "But I promise you this, Josie. You're safer with me than you ever were with him." The statement, so bold, so presumptuous, hung in the air between them. Safer? With an outlaw, a man who had just disrupted her wedding and carried her off like a prize of war? The idea was absurd. And yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of protectiveness, that made her question her own assumptions. As darkness began to fall, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and fiery orange, they reached a small, secluded canyon. A narrow stream gurgled through it, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. A faint plume of smoke rose in the distance, indicating a campfire. Rhett slowed the horse to a walk, his hand resting lightly on her back, a touch that was both reassuring and unsettling. She could feel the warmth of his body through her thin dress, the steady beat of his heart against her spine. It was a strange, almost intimate sensation, one that she hadn't experienced in decades. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, his voice a low rumble in the gathering darkness. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and then reached up to help her down. Her legs, stiff from the long ride, nearly buckled beneath her. He caught her, his hands strong and steady on her waist. For a moment, they stood there, close enough for her to feel his breath on her face, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The moment stretched, charged with an unspoken tension. The air crackled with an energy that was both frightening and exhilarating. Josie felt a tremor run through her, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A spark of something that felt dangerously close to desire. She looked up into his rugged face and wondered, not for the first time, about his motives. It clearly wasn't a simple rescue, and his actions were too bold for a simple act of spite. So, what did Rhett Slade want with her, and what was the home he spoke of so enigmatically? The embers of the campfire glowed, casting flickering, deceptive shadows that seemed to embody the uncertainty of her present and her unknown future. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Forgotten Promise. The campfire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. The aroma of roasting meat mingled with the scent of pine and the damp earth, a surprisingly comforting blend after the day's tumultuous events. Rhett had built the fire with practiced ease, his movements efficient and economical, betraying years of living outdoors. He'd also managed to catch a rabbit, which was now sizzling over the flames, its savory scent making Josie's stomach rumble. She sat on a smooth, flat rock, wrapped in a thick, woolen blanket that Rhett had produced from his saddlebags. The blanket smelled faintly of horses and wood smoke, a scent that was surprisingly comforting. She watched him as he tended the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He moved with a quiet confidence, a self-sufficiency that was both admirable and intimidating. The young man she'd seen earlier, the one with Rhett's eyes, was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't even gotten a good look at him before they'd ridden off. She wondered if he was guarding their horses, or perhaps scouting the area. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. She was, after all, in the company of outlaws, men who lived outside the law, men who were likely accustomed to violence and danger. "Your son?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Rhett glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Caleb," he said simply. "He's keeping watch." She nodded, not knowing what else to say. The silence stretched out between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Josie felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her: fear, confusion, resentment, and a flicker of curiosity. Curiosity about this man, this stranger who claimed she was his, this man who had ripped her from her carefully constructed life and plunged her into the unknown. "Why, Rhett?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do it?" He looked at her then, his eyes, the color of the embers glowing in the fire, holding hers. He didn't answer immediately, instead taking a long, slow drag from a hand-rolled cigarette. The smoke curled around his head, obscuring his features for a moment, before dissipating into the night air. "You wouldn't have been happy," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "With him. And you know this how?" she challenged, her voice gaining strength. "You haven't seen me in over 30 years. You know nothing about my life, about my choices." He smiled then, a sad, almost wistful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know you, Josie. Better than you think." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it carefully, revealing a single, faded photograph. He handed it to her. Josie took the photograph, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a picture of her, taken when she was young, barely 20. She was laughing, her hair a cascade of auburn curls, her eyes sparkling with a youthful exuberance that she'd long forgotten. She was sitting on a fence, her legs dangling, her arms slung around the shoulder of a young man with dark, intense eyes and a cocky grin. A young Rhett Slade. The photograph was a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of a past she'd tried so desperately to bury. A past filled with stolen kisses, whispered promises, and a love that had burned with an intensity that had both terrified and exhilarated her. A love that had been forbidden, doomed from the start. "I kept it," he said, his voice a low murmur. "All these years." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, pain, regret, and a flicker of something else. Something that felt dangerously close to longing. We made a promise," she said, her voice trembling. "Under the old oak tree by the creek." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. To always be there for each other, no matter what. It was a childish promise, made in the heat of youthful passion, a promise that had been broken by circumstances, by distance, by the harsh realities of life. A promise that she had thought long forgotten. "But you left," she said, her voice accusing. "You rode away, without a word." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "I had to," he said. "There were things you didn't know. Things I couldn't tell you." "Things like being an outlaw?" she asked, her voice laced with bitterness. He didn't answer, the silence stretching out between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Josie looked back at the photograph, at the young, carefree faces staring back at her. She remembered that day, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the scent of wildflowers in the air, the feel of Rhett's hand in hers. She remembered the feeling of being utterly, completely alive. A feeling she hadn't felt since. He took a tin cup and poured some coffee from a blackened pot that was hanging over the fire. He offered it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the undeniable connection that still existed between them, despite the years, despite the secrets, despite everything. The night was silent except for the crackling fire. Rhett's hand lingered over hers for a fraction longer than necessary. The weight of the past, the unfulfilled promise, pressed down on them. It was a silent question hanging in the air. What did this all mean, and what would become of them now, after all this time? Chapter 4. The Rustler's Haven. The journey the next day was arduous, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged and unforgiving. They rode in silence for the most part, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Josie's body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she refused to complain. She was determined to show Rhett that she was not some fragile, pampered woman, despite her age and the life she'd led. She was a Callahan, and Callahans were made of sterner stuff. She studied him as they rode, trying to decipher the enigma that he was. He rode with an easy confidence, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert to any potential danger. He seemed to know this land intimately, navigating the treacherous trails with an instinctual grace. She wondered how many years he'd spent roaming these wild, untamed regions, living outside the law, a fugitive from justice. She also noticed the subtle changes in him since the previous night. The weariness she'd observed had been replaced by a renewed alertness, a heightened sense of awareness. He seemed harder, somehow more guarded. The brief flicker of vulnerability she'd glimpsed in the firelight was gone, replaced by a mask of impassivity. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, they reached their destination. It was a hidden valley, nestled deep within the mountains, a place seemingly untouched by civilization. A cluster of rough-hewn cabins stood huddled together, surrounded by a makeshift corral filled with horses. Smoke curled from several chimneys, indicating that the place was inhabited. "Welcome to Redemption," Rhett said, his voice a low rumble. Redemption. The irony of the name was not lost on Josie. A haven for outlaws, a place where they could escape the reach of the law, a place where they could redeem themselves? She doubted it. As they rode into the camp, several men emerged from the cabins, their faces wary, their hands resting on the guns strapped to their hips. They were a rough-looking bunch, their clothes dusty and worn, their faces weathered by the sun and wind. They looked at Josie with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Rhett dismounted and helped her down, his hand lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. She felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of fear and something else. "This is Josie," he said to the men, his voice firm and authoritative. "She's with me." The men exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall, lean man with a scarred face and a cold, menacing gaze, stepped forward. "Slade," he said, his voice a low growl. "You brought a woman here? Are you out of your mind?" Rhett's eyes narrowed, his hand moving instinctively towards the gun at his hip. "She's my concern, Cutter," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And I suggest you remember that." The two men stared at each other, the tension between them palpable. Josie felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She was clearly not welcome here, and she had a feeling that Rhett's protection might not be enough to keep her safe. Caleb, Rhett's son, appeared from the shadows, his hand resting on the butt of his own gun. He looked at Josie, his eyes, so like his father's, filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Pa," he said, his voice low, "maybe it's best if she stays in our cabin."
"For now."
Rhett nodded, his gaze still locked on Cutter's. "Good idea, son." He turned to Josie, his expression softening slightly. "Come on," he said, his voice gentler now. I'll show you where you'll be staying. He led her towards one of the cabins, a small, cramped structure made of rough-hewn logs. It was sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a rickety table, and 2 chairs. A small, stone fireplace dominated one wall. It was a far cry from the comfortable, if somewhat stifling, home she'd left behind in Harmony Creek. It ain't much, Rhett said, his voice apologetic, but it's safe. Safe? Josie wasn't so sure. She was surrounded by outlaws, in a place hidden from the law, a place where violence and danger were likely everyday occurrences. And yet, she felt a strange sense of security. Being with Rhett, despite everything, she trusted him. Or perhaps, she trusted the memory of the young man she'd once loved, the young man who had promised to always be there for her. He lit a fire in the hearth, the flames quickly chasing away the chill that had settled in the cabin. He then brought in some blankets and a few meager provisions. I'll be back later, he said, his voice hesitant. With some food. He turned to leave, but then hesitated, his hand on the doorframe. He looked back at her, his eyes, dark and unreadable, searching hers. Josie, he said, his voice low and rough, I know this ain't what you expected. I know I've turned your life upside down. But I had to do it. I had to bring you here.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, instead simply shaking his head.
You'll understand, he said. Soon.
And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the small, cramped cabin, surrounded by silence and shadows, and the unsettling feeling that her life had just taken another, even more unpredictable, turn. Outside, the sounds of the camp slowly died down, leaving a stillness punctuated only by the distant howl of a coyote. She was in a den of thieves, a place called Redemption, but she had a feeling that her own redemption, her own understanding, was still a long way off. And the most pressing question was, why had he brought her here? Chapter 5. Shadows of Doubt and Desire. The food Rhett brought was simple fare, beans, bacon, and hardtack biscuits. But Josie was surprisingly hungry, and she ate with a relish she hadn't felt in years. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared past and the uncertainty of their present. She watched him as he ate, his movements deliberate, his gaze focused on his plate. He seemed different here, in his own element. More at ease, more himself. The lines of tension around his eyes had softened, and there was a relaxed quality to his posture that she hadn't seen before. This redemption, she said, breaking the silence, how long has it been here? He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. A few years, he said. We built it ourselves. A place where men could start over. Where they could escape their past. And what about their pasts? She asked, her voice hesitant. What kind of men are they? He didn't answer immediately, instead taking a long sip of his coffee. Men who made mistakes, he said finally. Men who were forced to make choices they wouldn't have made under different circumstances. Outlaws, she said, stating the obvious. He nodded, his expression somber.
Some, he said.
But not all. Some are just lost, looking for a place to belong. She thought of Cutter, the man with the scarred face and the cold, menacing gaze. He didn't look lost. He looked dangerous. And she wondered about Rhett, about the choices he'd made, the life he'd led. He'd said he had to leave, all those years ago. He'd said there were things she didn't know. Things he couldn't tell her. What about you, Rhett? She asked, her voice low. What brought you here? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. The silence stretched out between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. It's a long story, he said finally. I have time, she said. He smiled then, a sad, almost wistful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Maybe someday I'll tell you, he said. But not tonight. She nodded, accepting his reluctance. She knew that pushing him would only make him withdraw further. She had to be patient, to earn his trust, to understand him. He finished his food and stood up, his movements stiff. I should go, he said. Make sure everything's secure. He hesitated at the door, his hand on the latch. He looked back at her, his eyes, dark and unreadable, searching hers. "Josie," he said, his voice low and rough. Are you afraid of me?" The question caught her off guard. She considered it for a moment, honestly assessing her own feelings. Was she afraid? Yes, a part of her was. She was afraid of the unknown, of the danger that surrounded her, of the choices she might have to make. But was she afraid of him? I don't know, she said finally, her voice truthful. "I don't know what to think. I don't know who you are anymore." He nodded, his expression somber. "I understand," he said. "But I promise you this, Josie. I would never hurt you." The words, so simple, yet so profound, sent a shiver down her spine. She believed him. Despite everything, she believed him. And that, perhaps, was the most frightening thing of all. He left, closing the door behind him, leaving her alone in the small, cramped cabin. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. She thought of Arthur, of the life she'd almost had, of the safety and security she'd left behind. She thought of Rhett, of the young man she'd once loved, of the outlaw he'd become, of the undeniable connection that still existed between them. She felt a stirring within her, a warmth that spread through her limbs, a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades. It was a dangerous feeling, a forbidden feeling, a feeling that she knew she shouldn't indulge. But it was there, undeniable, a spark of desire in the darkness of her doubt. She looked at the closed door and shivered again. Was it fear that made her skin prickle, or something else, something that felt a lot like longing? The shadows in the cabin seemed to deepen, mirroring the growing uncertainty in her heart. Was this a new beginning, or the beginning of the end? Chapter 6. Beneath a Blanket of Stars. Sleep eluded Josie. The unfamiliar surroundings, the events of the past 2 days, and the unsettling presence of Rhett Slade all conspired to keep her awake. She tossed and turned on the narrow bed, the rough blankets scratching against her skin. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying embers in the fireplace and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, unable to bear the confines of the cabin any longer, she rose and slipped outside. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. The sky was a vast, inky canvas, studded with a million stars. It was a sight of breathtaking beauty, a sight that reminded her of the vastness of the world and the insignificance of her own small worries. She walked a short distance from the cabin, away from the flickering lights of the camp, and sat down on a large, flat rock. She wrapped the woolen blanket around her shoulders, drawing comfort from its warmth and familiar scent. She gazed up at the stars, letting their timeless beauty soothe her troubled mind. She remembered nights like this, years ago, when she and Rhett would lie on a blanket under the stars, whispering secrets and dreams to each other. They'd seemed so young, so carefree, their lives stretching out before them like an endless, uncharted territory. They'd made promises, vows of eternal love, promises that had been broken by the harsh realities of life. A sound behind her made her jump. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, to see Rhett standing there, silhouetted against the starlit sky. He was holding a blanket, which he spread out on the rock beside her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on his face. He looked different in the starlight. Softer, somehow. Less guarded. The lines of tension around his eyes seemed to have vanished, replaced by a gentle, almost vulnerable expression. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body through the layers of their blankets. The silence stretched out between them, comfortable and companionable, a stark contrast to the tense silences of the past few hours. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice a whisper, gesturing towards the sky. He nodded, his gaze following hers.
"It is," he said.
"Reminds me of when we were young." She glanced at him, her heart aching with a mixture of nostalgia and regret.
"We were foolish," she said.
"Making promises we couldn't keep." He turned to her, his eyes, dark and luminous in the starlight, searching hers. "Were they foolish, Josie?" he asked. "Or were they just premature?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered, unspoken. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She felt a stirring within her, a warmth that spread through her limbs, a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades. It was a dangerous feeling, a forbidden feeling, a feeling that she knew she shouldn't indulge. But it was there, undeniable, a spark of desire rekindled by the shared memories and the magic of the night. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, tentative. Her skin tingled where his fingers brushed against hers. She didn't pull away. I never forgot you, Josie, he said, his voice low and rough. Not for a single day. She looked at him then, her eyes meeting his. She saw a sincerity in his gaze, a depth of emotion that she couldn't ignore. She saw the young man she'd once loved, the man who had stolen her heart and then ridden away, leaving her with nothing but a broken promise and a faded photograph. And I never stopped thinking about you, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He squeezed her hand, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, smell the faint scent of tobacco and wood smoke that clung to him. Josie, he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. He was going to kiss her. She knew it, and she knew that she should stop him. She should pull away, remind him of the circumstances, of the danger, of the impossibility of it all. But she didn't. She couldn't. His lips brushed against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. She closed her eyes, her senses overwhelmed by the feel of his mouth on hers, by the warmth of his body, by the memories that flooded back, bringing tears. It was a kiss of longing, of regret, of a love that had been denied for far too long. A kiss that spoke of second chances, of possibilities, of a future that was as uncertain as the vast, starlit sky above them. But also, a kiss filled with unspoken truths. As their lips parted, a distant sound broke the spell, a sound that sent a chill of dread down her spine, the sound of horses, approaching fast. Rhett pulled back, his eyes instantly alert, his hand moving instinctively towards the gun at his hip. The moment, the magic, was shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. Who was coming, and what did it mean for them? The stars seemed to dim, as if foreshadowing the trouble that was riding towards them, out of the darkness. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom. The approaching riders materialized out of the darkness, their horses' hooves pounding the ground like a drumbeat of impending doom. Josie recognized Cutter, his scarred face contorted in a sneer, leading a group of about a dozen men. They were armed to the teeth, their rifles glinting ominously in the moonlight. Rhett stood up, his body tense, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. Cutter, he said, his voice dangerously low. What's the meaning of this? Cutter dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Rhett with a mixture of hatred and triumph. We're taking over, Slade, he said, his voice a low growl. Redemption is ours now. What are you talking about? Rhett demanded, his voice rising in anger. We built this place together. We agreed, Cutter laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. Agreements are for fools, Slade, he said. And you've always been a fool. Too soft. Too sentimental. This place needs a strong leader, someone who isn't afraid to take what he wants. Josie watched in horror as the scene unfolded before her. She realized now that Cutter had been planning this all along, that he'd been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. She also realized that she was the catalyst, the excuse he'd needed to make his move. He saw her as a weakness, a liability, a sign of Rhett's softening resolve. You won't get away with this, Cutter, Rhett said, his voice shaking with rage. The others, they won't stand for it. Cutter gestured towards the other men, who were now dismounting and surrounding them. They're with me, Slade, he said. They understand the need for change. They understand that a woman like her, he spat the word, his eyes filled with contempt as he looked at Josie, has no place here. Josie felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to defend herself, to defend Rhett. She stood up, her back straight, her chin lifted. I am not afraid of you, Cutter, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Cutter laughed again, his eyes mocking. "You should be, old woman," he said. "You should be very afraid." He turned back to Rhett, his expression hardening. "You have a choice, Slade," he said. "Join us, or die." Rhett didn't hesitate. "I'll die before I join you. You backstabbing traitor," he said, his voice filled with contempt. Cutter shrugged, his expression indifferent.
"So be it," he said.
He raised his hand, signaling his men. They moved forward, their weapons drawn. Josie knew that this was it. This was the end. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But then a shot rang out, followed by another and another. Josie opened her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest, to see Caleb, Rhett's son, standing on the edge of the camp, his rifle blazing. He was joined by several other men who had remained loyal to Rhett, men who were now fighting back against Cutter's betrayal. The night erupted in chaos, the sound of gunfire mixing with the shouts of men and the screams of horses. Josie found herself caught in the middle of a brutal firefight, a battle for control of redemption, a battle for survival. Rhett pushed her down behind the rock, shielding her with his body. "Stay down," he yelled, his voice barely audible above the din. He drew his own gun and began firing, his aim deadly accurate. Josie watched in horror as men fell around them, their bodies riddled with bullets. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. She saw Cutter, his face contorted in rage, raise his rifle and aim it at Rhett. She screamed, a wordless cry of terror, but it was too late. Cutter fired. Rhett grunted, his body jerking backward. He stumbled, his hand clutching his side. Josie saw the blood, spreading rapidly across his shirt, staining the fabric a dark, ominous crimson. "Rhett!" she screamed, scrambling towards him. He fell to his knees, his face pale, his breathing ragged. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "Josie," he whispered, his voice barely audible.
I'm sorry."
She cradled his head in her lap, her tears streaming down her face, mixing with the blood that was soaking through his shirt. She felt his life ebbing away, his body growing cold. The price of freedom, she realized, was often paid in blood. And she had a terrible feeling that Rhett was about to pay the ultimate price. The fighting continued around them, but she was oblivious to it all. Her world had narrowed to this one, dying man, the man she'd once loved, the man who had stolen her away, the man who was now slipping away from her forever. The question remained, could she save him? And if not, what would become of her? Chapter 8. A Past Unveiled. The gunfire gradually subsided, the shouts of men fading into groans and whimpers. Josie remained huddled on the ground, cradling Rhett's head in her lap, her tears falling onto his pale face. She could feel his life slipping away, his breath growing shallow, his pulse weak and erratic. Caleb appeared beside her, his face grim, his clothes stained with blood. He knelt down, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and determination. "Pa," he said, his voice choked with emotion. We drove them off. Cutter's gone." Rhett opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on his son with difficulty. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Caleb looked at Josie, his eyes pleading.
"We need to get him inside," he said.
"We need to stop the bleeding." Josie nodded, her mind racing. She knew that they had to act quickly, that every second counted. With Caleb's help, she managed to lift Rhett and carry him back to the cabin. They laid him on the bed, his body limp and unresponsive. Josie tore strips of cloth from her petticoat, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the flow of blood. The wound was deep, a gaping hole in his side, just below his ribs. She pressed the cloth against the wound, applying pressure, but the blood continued to seep through, staining the fabric a dark, ominous crimson. We need a doctor," she said, her voice desperate. Caleb shook his head, his expression grim. "There's no doctor here," he said. "And we can't risk going to town. Cutter Hill have men watching the roads." Josie felt a surge of despair, a sense of helplessness. She was trapped in a remote outlaw camp, with a dying man and no way to get help. She looked at Rhett, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow and labored. She remembered the young man she'd once loved, the man who had promised to always be there for her. And now, he was slipping away, and she was powerless to stop it. There must be something we can do, she said, her voice pleading. Caleb hesitated, his gaze fixed on his father's face.
There's an old woman, he said.
She lives in the hills. They say she knows about healing, about herbs and things. Can you find her? Josie asked, her voice desperate. Caleb nodded, his expression determined. I'll go, he said. I'll bring her back. He turned to leave, but then hesitated, his hand on the doorframe. He looked back at Josie, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear.
Stay with him, he said.
Don't let him die. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving Josie alone with the dying man. She sat beside the bed, holding Rhett's hand, her fingers intertwined with his. She felt his pulse, weak and thready, a fragile thread connecting him to life. She began to talk to him, her voice low and soothing, telling him stories of their youth, of the days they'd spent together, of the love they'd shared. She spoke of the old oak tree, of the creek where they'd made their promises, of the faded photograph she'd found in his pouch. As she talked, a memory surfaced, a memory she'd suppressed for years, a memory that held the key to Rhett's past, to the reason he'd left her all those years ago. She remembered the day he'd ridden away, the look of anguish on his face, the words he'd whispered before he'd disappeared. I have to go, Josie. I have to protect you. Protect her? From what? She'd never understood, until now. She remembered the rumors, the whispers she'd heard after he'd left, whispers of a feud, a blood feud between the Slades and another family, the McCains. A feud that had started over land, over water rights, a feud that had claimed the lives of several men on both sides. She remembered her father, his face grim, his voice filled with anger and fear. He'd forbidden her to see Rhett, telling her that he was dangerous, that he was involved in things she couldn't understand. She defied him, of course, meeting Rhett in secret, their love growing stronger with each stolen moment. But then, one day, Rhett had simply vanished. And she'd never known why. Until now. She realized that Rhett had left to protect her, to keep her safe from the violence that was consuming his family. He'd sacrificed his own happiness, his own future, to shield her from the consequences of his past. Rhett, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, I understand now. I understand why you left. His eyes flickered open, his gaze focusing on her with difficulty. He tried to speak, but only a faint, gurgling sound escaped his lips. Don't talk, she said, her voice soothing. Save your strength. She leaned closer, her lips brushing against his forehead. She felt his skin, cold and clammy, the unmistakable sign of approaching death. A wave of grief washed over her, a grief so profound, so overwhelming, that she thought she would drown in it. But then, she felt a faint squeeze of her hand, a flicker of life in his dying body. And she knew that she couldn't give up. She had to fight for him, just as he had fought for her, all those years ago. He was fading, but a flicker of the old Rhett, the one from the photograph, remained. The question was, could she keep that flame alive long enough for help to arrive, and what secrets would be revealed if he did survive? The past, she realized, was not dead, it was merely waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 9. The Sheriff's Pursuit. The old woman, whose name was Alara, arrived just before dawn, her face as weathered and wrinkled as the ancient hills she called home. She was small and frail, but her eyes, dark and piercing, held a wisdom that belied her age. Caleb had brought her on the back of his horse, riding through the night, risking capture to save his father's life. Alara examined Rhett's wound with a practiced eye, her touch gentle but firm. She muttered to herself in a language Josie didn't understand, a mixture of Spanish and something older, something that sounded like the whispers of the wind through the canyons. He's lost a lot of blood, Alara said, her voice raspy but surprisingly strong. But he's strong. He has the will to live. She set to work, preparing a poultice of herbs and roots, her movements precise and economical. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle, and then applied the poultice, binding it with strips of cloth that Josie had torn from her petticoat. This will help, Alara said. But he needs rest. And he needs to be quiet. She gave Josie instructions on how to care for Rhett, how to change the poultice, how to brew a tea from certain herbs that would help him regain his strength. She spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, her words often cryptic and mysterious. The spirits they are with him, Alara said, her eyes fixed on Rhett's face. But he must fight. He must choose to live. Caleb stayed with Josie, helping her care for his father. He was a quiet, watchful young man, but Josie sensed a deep strength beneath his reserved exterior. He clearly adored his father, and he was willing to do anything to save him. As the day wore on, Rhett's condition remained precarious. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever rising and falling. Josie sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes never leaving his face. She prayed, not to the God of the church she'd almost married in, but to the ancient spirits of the land, the spirits that Alara had invoked. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Josie and Caleb, Sheriff Brody of Harmony Creek, a man known for his tenacity and his unwavering adherence to the law, had picked up Rhett's trail. Arthur Pemberton, humiliated and enraged by Josie's abduction, had demanded that Brody bring Rhett to justice, dead or alive. Brody, accompanied by a posse of armed men, had followed Rhett's tracks across the plains, his determination fueled by a mixture of duty and a personal vendetta against Rhett Slade. Brody had always resented Rhett, envying his charisma, his reputation, his freedom. He saw this as an opportunity to finally bring the outlaw down, to prove his own worth, to erase the stain on his own honor. He had a personal history with outlaw gangs, and none of it was good. The posse reached the foothills, the terrain becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Brody, however, was relentless, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to any sign of their quarry. He knew that Rhett was wounded, that he couldn't have gone far. He also knew that he was desperate, that he would be unpredictable. "He's holed up somewhere," Brody said to his deputy, a young, eager man named Thompson. He's like a wounded animal. Dangerous." Thompson nodded, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "We'll find him, Sheriff," he said. "We'll bring him in." Brody smiled, a cold, grim smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll bring him in," he said. One way or another. Back in Redemption, Josie felt a growing sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was lurking just around the corner. She looked at Rhett, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow and labored. She knew that they were running out of time. As dusk began to fall, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and fiery orange, Josie heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the sound of horses approaching fast. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it wasn't Caleb returning with supplies. It was the law, and they were coming for Rhett. The sheriff was closing in, and she knew that this time, there would be no escape. The question was, would Rhett be strong enough to face him, or would this pursuit end in tragedy, not just for Rhett, but for all of them? Chapter 10. Scars of Yesterday. Josie ran to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the gaps in the rough-hewn logs, she could see them. Sheriff Brody and his posse, their horses silhouetted against the fading light, their faces grim and determined. They were surrounding the cabin, cutting off any escape route. She turned back to Rhett, his eyes still closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was in no condition to fight, to run, to even speak. She knew that she had to do something, anything, to protect him. She thought of Alara, of the herbs she'd used, of the poultice she'd applied to Rhett's wound. She remembered the old woman's words. He must fight. He must choose to live. She knelt beside the bed, taking Rhett's hand in hers. His skin was cold and clammy, his pulse weak and thready. She squeezed his hand, her fingers intertwined with his. "Rhett," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Rhett, you have to wake up. You have to fight." His eyes flickered open, his gaze unfocused, his pupils dilated. He tried to speak, but only a faint, gurgling sound escaped his lips. Don't talk, she said, her voice soothing. Save your strength. They're here. The sheriff, he's come for you. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition in their depths. He understood.
He knew the danger they were in.
She heard the sound of boots outside the cabin, the creak of leather, the murmur of voices. They were coming. She had to buy time, to give Red a chance, however slim, to recover. She stood up, her back straight, her chin lifted. She was a Callahan, and Callahans didn't back down. She would face them. She would stall them. She would do whatever it took to protect the man she loved. She walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Sheriff Brody stood before her, his face hard and unforgiving, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. He was a tall, imposing man, his eyes cold and calculating. He looked at Josie, his expression a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Josie Callahan, he said, his voice a low drawl. I'd heard you'd run off with that outlaw. Never thought you had it in you. He's not an outlaw, Josie said, her voice surprisingly steady. He's a good man. Brody laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. Good man?
He said.
He's a thief, a murderer, a fugitive from justice. And you're harboring him. That makes you an accomplice. He's wounded, Josie said, her voice pleading. He needs help. Brody's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on the cabin behind her. I'm here to take him in, Josie, he said. Dead or alive. Step aside. No, Josie said, her voice firm. I won't let you. She stood her ground, blocking the entrance to the cabin, her body a fragile barrier between Rhett and the law. Brody looked at her, his expression hardening. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Josie, he said. I don't want to hurt you. You won't hurt him, Josie said, her voice unwavering. Brody sighed, his patience wearing thin. He gestured towards his men, who were now surrounding the cabin, their guns drawn.
Take her, he said.
Two of the men stepped forward, grabbing Josie's arms, their grip rough and unforgiving. She struggled against them, but they were too strong. They dragged her away from the door, throwing her to the ground. Brody stepped past her, entering the cabin, his gun drawn. Josie watched in horror, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was it. This was the end. She heard Brody's voice, harsh and commanding. Rhett Slade, he said. You're under arrest. A moment of silence followed, broken only by the sound of Josie's sobbing. Then a shot rang out, followed by another and another. Josie screamed, a wordless cry of terror. She scrambled to her feet, trying to get back to the cabin, but the men held her back, their grip tightening. The shooting stopped. A moment of agonizing silence followed. Then, Brody emerged from the cabin, his face grim, his clothes stained with blood. He looked at Josie, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and regret. He had a fresh scar across his cheek, a twin of an older, faded scar that Josie now recognized. The older scar, was from Rhett. From a fight, years ago, a fight that had fueled Brody's hatred. He's dead, Brody said, his voice flat. Josie felt a wave of grief wash over her, a grief so profound, so overwhelming, that she thought she would collapse. She had failed. She had failed to protect him. She had lost him, forever. But as Brody walked away, something caught her eye, a glint of metal in the dirt near the cabin door. It was Rhett's gun, the one he always carried. And next to it a small, worn leather pouch. The pouch Josie knew contained a photograph. The photograph of them, young and in love. Why would Rhett have dropped them if he was dead? A flicker of doubt, a spark of hope, ignited within her. Was it truly over? Or was there something more, something Brody wasn't telling her? Chapter 11. The Dance of Deception. Josie was taken back to Harmony Creek, not as a bride-to-be, but as a prisoner. Arthur Pemberton, his face a mask of righteous indignation, had pressed charges against her, accusing her of aiding and abetting a known outlaw. She was held in the town's small, dusty jail cell, the iron bars a stark reminder of her lost freedom. The townsfolk, who had once looked at her with envy, now looked at her with scorn and condemnation. She was a pariah, an outcast, a woman who had betrayed her community, her betrothed. Only her brother, Thomas, stood by her, his face etched with worry and a flicker of understanding. He visited her every day, bringing her food and news, trying to offer some comfort in her bleak situation. "I don't understand, Joe," he said, his voice low and troubled. "Why did you do it? Why did you run off with him?" Josie looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and defiance. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. She couldn't tell him that Rhett might still be alive, that Brody might have lied. It was too dangerous, too uncertain. I don't know," she said, her voice evasive.
I just snapped.
Thomas sighed, his expression somber. They're talking about a trial," he said. "A quick one. Arthur, he wants justice." Josie knew what justice meant in Harmony Creek. It meant a hanging, a swift and brutal end to her life. She felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct to survive. She had to escape, to find out the truth, to find Rhett if he was still alive. She remembered the pouch, the photograph, the gun. Why had Rhett dropped them? Was it a signal? A message? A clue? She had to get back to Redemption, to the cabin, to find the answers. She began to formulate a plan, a desperate gamble, a dance of deception. She would play the part of the repentant sinner, the grieving widow, the woman who had been led astray by a charismatic outlaw. She would lull them into a false sense of security, and then, when the opportunity presented itself, she would escape. She started by apologizing to Arthur, her voice choked with fabricated remorse. She told him that she'd been foolish, that she'd been blinded by Rhett's lies, that she deeply regretted her actions. Arthur, his ego bruised but his vanity intact, seemed to soften towards her. He visited her in jail, his expression a mixture of pity and self-satisfaction. I forgive you, Josie," he said, his voice pompous. "I understand you were vulnerable. You were under his spell." Josie lowered her head, her eyes filled with fake tears. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for understanding." She continued to play the part, her performance growing more convincing with each passing day. She convinced the jailer, a simple, gullible man named Jed, that she was no longer a threat, that she was broken. She waited, patiently, for her opportunity. It came one evening, during a fierce thunderstorm. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the jailhouse windows, the thunder echoing like cannon fire. Jed, unnerved by the storm, had taken to drinking heavily. Josie watched him, her eyes sharp and calculating. She saw him stumble, his movements clumsy, his speech slurred. She knew that this was her chance. She called out to him, her voice weak and pleading. "Jed," she said, "I am feeling sick. I need some water." Jed grumbled, his head swaying, but he eventually complied. He unlocked her cell, his keys jangling, and shuffled towards the water bucket. As he bent over, his back to her, Josie moved. She sprang from her cot, her movements swift and silent. She grabbed the heavy iron candlestick from the table, her hand trembling, and brought it down on Jed's head with all her strength. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious, his body limp. Josie stood over him, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had done it. She had taken the first step towards freedom, or so she thought. But as she grabbed the keys and slipped out into the stormy night, she had no idea of the web of lies and betrayals that awaited her. The storm raged on, mirroring the tempest in her heart and the uncertain path that lay ahead, a path that would lead her back to redemption and to the truth about Rhett Slade, and to a confrontation she could not yet imagine. Chapter 12. Trapped between two worlds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening in the morning sun. Josie rode Thomas's spare horse, a sturdy mare, pushing it as hard as she dared without risking exhaustion. She had to reach redemption, had to uncover the truth about Rhett, before Brody or Arthur's men found her again. She rode through familiar territory, the landscape of her childhood, the rolling plains and distant hills that had once represented home and security. But now, everything felt different. She was an outlaw, a fugitive, a woman trapped between two worlds, the world of her past, the world of Harmony Creek and Arthur Pemberton, and the world of her present, the world of Rhett Slade and redemption. She felt a pang of guilt, thinking of Thomas, of the trouble she'd caused him. She knew he would be worried, that he would be searching for her. But she couldn't go back, not yet. She had to finish what she'd started, had to find out if Rhett was alive or dead. As she approached the foothills, she grew more cautious, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, alert to any sign of pursuit. She knew that Brody would be looking for her, that he would be relentless. She reached the hidden valley, the entrance to redemption, just as the sun was beginning to set. The camp was quiet, eerily so. There were no horses in the corral, no smoke curling from the chimneys, no sign of life. It was a ghost town, a place abandoned and forgotten. She dismounted, her legs stiff and aching, and cautiously approached the cabin, her hand resting on the knife she'd taken from Jed's belt. The door was ajar, creaking in the gentle breeze. She pushed it open, her heart pounding in her chest, and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, stripped bare of any personal belongings. The fire in the hearth was cold, the ashes long dead. There was no sign of Rhett, no sign of Caleb, no sign of anyone. But then she saw it. On the floor, near where Rhett had fallen, a small, almost imperceptible stain. A blood stain. But it was dry.
Too dry.
It had been there for days, perhaps even longer. She remembered Brody's words. He's dead. She remembered the blood on his clothes, the look in his eyes. She remembered the gun, the pouch, lying on the ground outside the cabin. A realization dawned on her, a chilling, terrifying realization. Brody had lied. Rhett hadn't died in the cabin. He'd been taken.
But where?
And by whom? She searched the cabin frantically, looking for any clue, any sign, any message. She found nothing. The cabin was empty, a hollow shell, a testament to a life interrupted, a love betrayed. She stepped back outside, her mind racing. She had to think, to reason, to figure out what had happened. She remembered Cutter, the man who had betrayed Rhett, the man who had tried to take over redemption. He was gone, too. Had he taken Rhett? Was he holding him prisoner? She remembered Caleb, Rhett's son. He'd gone to fetch Alara, the old woman who knew about healing. Had he returned? Had he found his father? Was he alive? She had to find Caleb. He was the key, the only one who might know the truth. But where to start? She had no idea where he might have gone, where he might be hiding. She looked around the deserted camp, her eyes scanning the surrounding hills. She felt a sense of despair, of helplessness. She was alone, in a hostile environment, with no one to turn to, no one to trust. But then she saw it. A faint trail, leading away from the camp, towards the mountains. It was barely visible, almost obscured by the undergrowth. But it was there, a sign, a glimmer of hope. She mounted her horse, her determination renewed. She would follow the trail. She would find Caleb. She would find Rhett. She had to. Her life, her future, depended on it. She rode into the deepening twilight, the mountains looming before her, their peaks shrouded in mist, their secrets hidden in the shadows. She was trapped between two worlds, but she was determined to find her way, to find the truth, to find her love. The trail was faint, but it was there, a fragile thread connecting her to a possible future, a future that she had to fight for, no matter the cost. And she knew, with a growing certainty, that this was far from over. Chapter 13. Whispers in the Saloon. The trail led Josie to a small, isolated town nestled deep within the mountains. It was a rough and tumble place, a haven for miners, prospectors, and outlaws. The buildings were ramshackle, the streets dusty and unpaved, the atmosphere one of lawlessness and desperation. She rode into town cautiously, her eyes scanning the faces of the men she passed. They were a hard-looking bunch, their clothes worn and dirty, their eyes wary and suspicious. She knew that she had to be careful, that one wrong move could put her in danger. She needed information, a lead, a whisper of where Caleb or even Cutter might have gone. She decided to try the town saloon, the most likely place to gather gossip, to overhear conversations, to find a clue. The saloon was dimly lit, filled with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and tobacco smoke. A piano player banged out a raucous tune, his fingers flying over the keys. Men were gathered at the bar, drinking, gambling, talking in low voices. Josie entered, her hand resting on the knife sheathed at her belt. She felt the eyes of the men on her, assessing, judging, questioning. She ignored them, walking towards the bar with as much confidence as she could muster. She ordered a drink, a whiskey, something she rarely indulged in, but she needed to blend in, to appear unremarkable. She sipped the fiery liquid, her eyes scanning the room, her ears straining to catch any snippet of conversation that might be useful. She overheard snatches of talk about gold strikes, claim jumping, and a recent shootout. Her heart quickened. Could it be related to Rhett, to Cutter, to redemption? She leaned closer to a group of men huddled at a nearby table, their voices low and conspiratorial. They were talking about a man named Slade, a man who had been captured. Heard he was shot, one of the men said, his voice slurred with drink.
Badly. Cutter's got him, another man said.
Heard he's holding him prisoner.
Why?
A third man asked. The first man shrugged. Something to do with revenge. Heard they had history. Josie's heart pounded in her chest. It was Rhett. They were talking about Rhett. He was alive, but he was a prisoner. Cutter had him. She needed more information. She needed to know where Cutter had taken him, where he was holding him. She had to find a way to rescue him. She approached the men at the table, her voice hesitant but determined. "Excuse me," she said. I couldn't help but overhear you were talking about a man named Slade." The men looked at her, their eyes suspicious. "Who wants to know?" The first man asked, his voice gruff. Josie took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I'm a friend," she said. I need to find him." The men exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. He's in trouble," the second man said. "Deep trouble." "I know," Josie said. "That's why I needed to help him." The men hesitated, their eyes assessing her, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. Finally, the third man spoke. "Cutter's got him at the old Black Ridge mine," he said. It's about a day's ride from here. North through Devil's Pass." Josie's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. She had a location. She had a destination. But Black Ridge Mine, Devil's Pass, the names were ominous, filled with danger. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for telling me." She turned to leave, but the first man stopped her. "Be careful, lady," he said. "Cutter, he's a dangerous man. He won't hesitate to kill you." Josie nodded, her expression grim. "I know," she said. "But I have to try." She left the saloon, stepping out into the cool night air. She had a plan, a desperate gamble, a race against time. She had to reach Black Ridge Mine. She had to find Rhett. She had to save him. But as she mounted her horse and rode out of town, she knew that the odds were stacked against her. She was one woman alone against a ruthless outlaw and his gang. The whispers in the saloon had given her a direction, but they had also revealed the depth of the danger she faced. And she knew that this journey would test her courage, her resilience, and her love in ways she could never have imagined. Chapter 14. A Showdown at Dusk. The ride to Black Ridge Mine was treacherous, the trail winding through narrow canyons and across steep, rocky slopes. Devil's Pass lived up to its name. A narrow gorge with sheer cliffs on either side, a place where one wrong step could mean a fatal fall. Josie rode cautiously, her senses alert, her hand never far from the knife at her belt. She thought of Rhett, of his strength, his resilience, his love. She imagined him, imprisoned, wounded, perhaps dying. The thought spurred her on, giving her the strength to overcome her fear, her exhaustion, her doubt. As dusk began to fall, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and fiery orange, she reached the mine. It was an abandoned, desolate place, the entrance a gaping black hole in the side of the mountain. Several ramshackle buildings stood nearby, their windows dark and empty, their roofs sagging. It looked like the very mouth of hell. She dismounted, tying her horse to a scraggly tree a short distance from the mine entrance. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the area, her ears straining for any sound. She heard nothing but the wind whistling through the canyons, the distant cry of a hawk. She knew that Cutter and his men were inside, that they were waiting for her. She had to be careful, to be smart. She couldn't just rush in, guns blazing. She had to use her wits, her cunning, her knowledge of the mine. She remembered stories her father had told her, stories about the old mines in the area, stories about secret entrances, hidden tunnels, forgotten passages. There had to be another way, and a way to surprise Cutter, a way to gain the upper hand. She circled the mine, her eyes searching the rocky terrain. She found it a small, almost invisible opening, hidden behind a cluster of boulders. It was an old ventilation shaft, long abandoned and forgotten. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was her only chance. She squeezed through the narrow opening, her body scraping against the rough rock. The shaft was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay. She crawled forward, her hands and knees bruised and bleeding, her heart pounding in her chest. The shaft sloped downward, gradually widening. She heard voices, faint at first, then growing louder. She was getting closer. She reached the end of the shaft, peering through a small crack in the rock. She saw a large cavern, illuminated by lanterns. Cutter and his men were there, gathered around a makeshift table, drinking, gambling, talking. And then she saw him.
Rhett.
He was tied to a chair, his body slumped, his head hanging low. He was bruised and battered, his clothes torn and blood-stained. He looked broken. Josie felt a surge of rage, a fierce determination to make Cutter pay. She had to get to Rhett. She had to free him. She had to save him. She looked around the cavern, assessing the situation. There were at least a dozen men, all armed. She was outnumbered, outgunned, out everything. But she had one advantage: surprise. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She would wait for the right moment, the opportune time, the moment of distraction. And then she would strike. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. A dispute erupted among the men, a heated argument over a card game. The voices grew louder, the tension rising. Cutter stood up, his face contorted in rage, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. This was it. Josie's moment. She burst through the crack in the rock, scrambling into the cavern, her knife drawn. She ran towards Rhett, her eyes fixed on his battered form.
Rhett!
She screamed, her voice echoing through the cavern. The men turned, their faces stunned, their eyes wide with surprise. Cutter whirled around, his hand reaching for his gun.
You!
He roared, his voice filled with rage. How did you? Josie didn't answer. She reached Rhett, slashing at the ropes that bound him, her knife cutting through the thick hemp. Get out of here! She yelled at him.
Run!
Rhett looked at her, his eyes dazed, his expression confused. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. He was too weak, too injured. Cutter raised his gun, aiming it at Josie. You're going to pay for this, old woman, he snarled. But then, a shot rang out, not from Cutter's gun, but from behind him. Cutter staggered, his eyes widening in disbelief, his hand clutching his chest. He stumbled backward, falling to the ground, his body limp. Josie turned, her eyes wide with shock, to see Caleb standing at the entrance to the cavern, his rifle smoking. He had followed her, he had tracked her, he had saved her. The other men, stunned by Cutter's sudden demise, hesitated. Caleb fired again, his aim deadly accurate. Chaos erupted, the men scattering, scrambling for cover, firing their weapons wildly. Josie grabbed Rhett, pulling him to his feet, supporting his weight.
"Come on," she said, her voice urgent.
"We have to go." They stumbled towards the entrance to the mine, Caleb covering their retreat, his rifle blazing. They made it outside, into the cool night air, the sound of gunfire fading behind them. They were free, for now. But the showdown at dusk had changed everything. The mine, a symbol of greed and darkness, had become the stage for a brutal confrontation, a testament to the enduring power of love and loyalty. And the question remained, could they truly escape the past, or would it continue to haunt them, casting a long shadow over their future? Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. They rode through the night, Caleb leading the way, Josie supporting Red on his horse, his body weak and trembling. They didn't speak, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves and Rhett's occasional, pained groans. Josie's mind raced, replaying the events of the past few days, the escape from jail, the whispers in the saloon, the showdown at the mine. She had risked everything, defied everyone, to save Rhett's life. And she had succeeded, at least for now. But what now? Where could they go? They were fugitives, outlaws, hunted by both the law and Cutter's remaining men. They had no home, no refuge, no future. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and orange, they reached a small, secluded cabin, hidden deep within the woods. It was a hunter's cabin, abandoned and dilapidated, but it offered shelter, a place to rest, a place to reckon with their situation. Caleb helped Rhett dismount, his movements gentle and careful. They carried him inside, laying him on a rough, straw-filled mattress. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged, his fever high. Josie knelt beside him, her heart aching with worry and love. She had to tend to his wounds, to ease his pain, to keep him alive. She remembered Alara, the old woman who had healed him before. She wished she had her knowledge, her skills, her magic. But she didn't. She had only her own determination, her own love. She used water from a nearby stream to clean his wounds, her touch gentle and soothing. She found some old, tattered cloths in the cabin, using them to bandage his injuries. She brewed a weak tea from some dried herbs she found hanging from the rafters, forcing him to drink it, spoonful by spoonful. Caleb watched her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew, as she did, that Rhett's condition was precarious, that his survival was uncertain. He needs a doctor, Caleb said, his voice low and troubled. Josie nodded, her expression grim.
"I know," she said.
"But we can't risk it. Not yet." They were trapped in a remote cabin, with a dying man and no way to get help. They were at the mercy of fate, of chance, of love. As the day wore on, Rhett's fever raged, his body racked with chills and tremors. He mumbled incoherently, his words a jumble of names, places, and memories. He spoke of Josie, of his love for her, of his regret. Josie listened, her heart breaking with each whispered word. She realized the depth of his feelings for her, the sacrifices he had made, the pain he had endured. She held his hand, her fingers intertwined with his, her tears falling onto his pale face. She spoke to him, her voice low and soothing, telling him stories of their past, of their dreams, of their future. She told him that she loved him, that she had always loved him, that she would never leave him. As night fell, Rhett's fever finally broke. His breathing became more regular, his pulse stronger. He opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on Josie with a clarity that she hadn't seen in days. "Josie," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling with relief. I'm here." He smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile that lit up his face.
You saved me," he said.
She shook her head, her tears flowing freely. "You saved me," she said. "You saved me a long time ago." He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. His fingers traced the lines around her eyes, the wrinkles that spoke of years of hardship, of waiting. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She leaned down, her lips brushing against his. It was a kiss of gratitude, of relief, of a love that had endured the test of time, the trials of fate, the scars of yesterday. But it was also a kiss of reckoning. A kiss that acknowledged the challenges that lay ahead, the uncertainties they faced, the price of their freedom. They had survived the night, but the dawn would bring new dangers, new choices, new confrontations. Their hearts had spoken, but their journey was far from over. They were still trapped, not just in the cabin, but in the web of their past and the uncertain future that stretched before them, as vast and unpredictable as the western sky. Chapter 16. Blood on the Sand. News of Cutter's death and Rhett's escape reached Sheriff Brody quickly. He was enraged, humiliated, his carefully constructed plan to bring Rhett to justice shattered. He knew that Josie was involved, that she had helped Rhett escape, that she was a traitor. He gathered his posse, his men armed and ready, their faces grim and determined. He was determined to find them, to bring them in, to make them pay. They can't have gone far, Brody said to his deputy, Thompson. They're there on foot. Rhett's wounded. Thompson nodded, his expression eager. We'll find them, Sheriff, he said. We'll track them down. Brody's obsession with Rhett went beyond duty, beyond the law. It was personal. He remembered the fight, years ago, the fight that had left him with a scar, a permanent reminder of his defeat. He remembered Rhett's words, his taunts, his arrogance. He had to settle the score, to prove his worth, to erase the shame. He followed their trail, his eyes scanning the ground, his senses alert. He found signs of their passage, broken branches, footprints, a discarded bandage stained with blood. He knew that they were heading towards the border, towards Mexico, towards freedom.
He wouldn't let them escape.
He would catch them, he would kill them. Meanwhile, Josie, Rhett, and Caleb were making their way south, slowly and painfully. Rhett was still weak, his wound still healing, his strength limited. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day, avoiding roads and trails, staying invisible. Josie cared for Rhett, tending to his wounds, feeding him, encouraging him. She was his strength, his support, his reason to live. Caleb scouted ahead, his eyes sharp and watchful, his senses alert to any danger. He was their protector, their guide, their hope. They reached the desert, the vast, desolate expanse of sand and rock that stretched between them and the border. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape, a place where survival was a constant struggle. They had little food, little water, little hope, but they had each other. They had their love, their loyalty, their determination. As they crossed the desert, they saw them. A cloud of dust on the horizon, growing larger, closer, faster. It was Brody and his posse. They had found them. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were trapped, in the open, exposed, vulnerable. They had to fight. Rhett, despite his weakness, insisted on standing, on facing his enemy. He took the rifle from Caleb, his hand trembling, his eyes determined. Go, Josie, he said, his voice low and urgent. Take Caleb and go. Get to Mexico. Josie shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. No, she said. I won't leave you. Caleb stood beside his father, his own rifle ready. We fight together, he said. Brody and his posse arrived, their horses skidding to a halt, their guns drawn. Brody dismounted, his face a mask of hatred and triumph. Slade, he said, his voice cold and hard. It's over. Rhett smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's never over, he said. A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind whistling across the desert. The sun beat down mercilessly, the heat shimmering in the air. It was a standoff, a moment of reckoning. Then the shooting started. It was a brief, brutal exchange of gunfire, the sound echoing across the desolate landscape. Men fell, horses screamed, bullets whizzed through the air. Josie found herself caught in the crossfire, her body exposed, her life in danger. She saw Rhett, his rifle blazing, his aim deadly. She saw Caleb, fighting beside his father, his courage unwavering. She saw Brody, his eyes fixed on Rhett, his gun aimed true. She screamed, a wordless cry of terror, but it was too late. Brody fired. Rhett staggered, his body jerking backward. He fell to his knees, his hand clutching his chest. He looked at Josie, his eyes filled with pain and love. "Josie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Josie ran towards him, her heart breaking with each step. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. She saw the blood spreading rapidly across his shirt, staining the sand a dark, ominous crimson. It was a mortal wound. This was it. This was the end. Caleb, seeing his father fall, let out a roar of rage and grief. He charged towards Brody, his rifle blazing. But Thompson, Brody's deputy, shot him down, his body falling lifeless to the sand. Josie was alone, surrounded by death and devastation. Brody approached her, his gun still smoking, his face triumphant. "It's over, Josie," he said. "You lost." Josie looked up at him, her eyes filled with hatred and despair. She had lost everything. Her love, her future, her hope. But as Brody reached for her, a glint of metal caught her eye. Rhett's knife, lying on the sand, within reach. With a surge of adrenaline, fueled by grief and rage, she grabbed it. The desert sand, stained with the blood of those she loved, became the backdrop for a final, desperate act. Chapter 17. Letters from a Lost Love. Josie's hand closed around the worn leather handle of Rhett's knife. With a strength born of desperation and grief, she lunged at Brody, the blade flashing in the harsh desert sunlight. The sheriff, caught off guard by the sudden attack, stumbled backward, his eyes widening in surprise and pain. The knife found its mark, sinking deep into his side. He cried out, a strangled gasp of agony, his hand clutching at the wound. He staggered, his gun falling from his grasp, landing with a thud on the blood-soaked sand. Josie, fueled by a rage she had never known before, pulled the knife free and struck again, and again, each blow a release of the pent-up sorrow, the betrayal, the years of lost love. Brody collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing, his lifeblood staining the sand a deeper crimson. Thompson and the remaining posse members, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated, their weapons lowered. They had witnessed the death of their leader, the brutal end of a relentless pursuit. They looked at Josie, her face contorted with grief and fury, her clothes stained with blood, and they saw not a helpless woman, but a force of nature, a vengeful spirit unleashed. Josie stood over Brody's lifeless body, her chest heaving, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at the carnage around her, the bodies of Rhett, Caleb, and the others, lying still and silent under the unforgiving desert sun. She had survived, but at what cost? She stumbled towards Rhett, collapsing beside him, her tears flowing freely. She cradled his head in her lap, her fingers stroking his hair, her lips pressing against his cold forehead. "Rhett," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Oh, Rhett, I'm so sorry." She noticed a small, leather-bound book tucked inside his shirt, partially hidden by his blood-stained vest. She carefully pulled it out, her hands trembling. It was a journal, his journal, filled with his handwriting, his thoughts, his secrets. She opened the journal, her eyes scanning the pages. She found entries dating back years, entries that spoke of his love for her, of his regret at leaving her, of his reasons. She read about the feud, the blood feud between the Slades and the McCains, the violence that had consumed his family. She read about his decision to leave, to protect her, to keep her safe from the consequences of his past. She read about his life as an outlaw, the choices he'd made, the burdens he'd carried. She read about his dreams, his hopes, his longing for her. And then, she found a series of letters addressed to her, letters that had never been sent. Letters filled with his love, his devotion, his unwavering belief in their reunion. The first letter was dated shortly after he had left Harmony Creek all those years ago. "My dearest Josie, I write this with a heavy heart, knowing that I have broken the promise I made to you under the old oak tree. I have left you, without a word, without an explanation. But I want you to know, my love, that I did it for you. I did it to protect you. There are things you do not know, Josie, things I could not tell you. My family is caught in a bitter feud, a blood feud that has claimed many lives. I could not, in good conscience, bring you into that world, expose you to that danger. I know that you will hate me, that you will curse my name, but I hope that someday you will understand. I hope that someday you will forgive me. I will always love you, Josie. You are the light of my life, the star that guides me through the darkness. And I will always be there for you, in spirit, if not in body. Yours eternally, Rhett. Josie read through the letters, her tears blurring the ink, her heart aching with each word. She realized the depth of his sacrifice, the magnitude of his love. He had given up everything for her, his happiness, his future, his life. She closed the journal, holding it close to her heart. She had found the truth, the answers she had sought, the redemption she had craved. But it had come at a terrible price. The remaining posse members, their spirit broken, their leader dead, had ridden away, leaving her alone in the desert, surrounded by the bodies of those she loved. She was alone, but she was not defeated. She had Rhett's journal, his letters, his memory. And she had a new purpose, to honor his sacrifice, to live the life he had given her. The blood on the sand was a testament to the violence, the loss, the cost of freedom. But it was also a testament to the enduring power of love, a love that had transcended time, distance, and death. She looked out at the vast expanse, a new strength filling her. She would carry their memory, their love, forward. Chapter 18. The Unforgiving Truth. Josie buried Rhett and Caleb on a small rise overlooking the desert, marking their graves with simple wooden crosses. She spent days there, mourning their loss, reading Rhett's journal, reliving their shared past, and coming to terms with her future. She learned more about Rhett's life through his writings, about the men he'd ridden with, the choices he'd made, the regrets he'd harbored. She discovered that redemption hadn't been just an outlaw camp, but a genuine attempt to create a new life, a place where men could escape their pasts and find redemption. She also learned about Cutter's betrayal, about his long-simmering resentment of Rhett, about his greed. She realized that Cutter had used her as a pawn, a way to destabilize Rhett, to seize control of redemption. And she learned about Brody's obsession with Rhett, about the old feud, the fight that had left him scarred, both physically and emotionally. She understood that Brody's pursuit of Rhett had been driven not by justice, but by revenge. The truth was unforgiving, brutal, and complex. There were no heroes, no villains, only flawed human beings caught in a web of violence, betrayal, and love. As the days turned into weeks, Josie began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The desert, once a symbol of desolation and despair, became a place of solace and reflection. She found a strength within herself that she hadn't known she possessed, a resilience forged by hardship, by loss, by love. She decided to return to Harmony Creek, not to seek revenge, not to reclaim her old life, but to set the record straight. She had to tell Thomas the truth, to clear Rhett's name, to find some measure of peace. She rode back, slowly and deliberately, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. She knew that she would face hostility, suspicion, and judgment. But she was no longer afraid. She had faced death, she had faced betrayal, she had faced herself. She arrived in Harmony Creek, a changed woman. She was no longer the meek, submissive Josie Callahan who had almost married Arthur Pemberton. She was a woman of strength, a woman of courage, a woman who had lived. She went straight to Thomas's farm, her heart pounding in her chest. She found him working in the fields, his face etched with worry and relief. "Josie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. You're alive." She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I am," she said. "And I have a story to tell you." She told him everything, from the moment Rhett had stormed into the church to the final, bloody confrontation in the desert. She showed him Rhett's journal, his letters, the evidence of his love, his sacrifice, his redemption. Thomas listened, his face a mixture of shock, disbelief, and growing understanding. He had always sensed that there was more to Josie's story, that she had secrets. I didn't know, he said, his voice trembling. I judged you wrongly. Josie reached out, taking his hand. It's okay, Thomas, she said. You didn't know. She told him about Brody's lies, about Cutter's betrayal, about everything. She told him that Rhett had died a hero, that he had saved her life. Thomas listened, his heart breaking with each word. He realized the depth of Josie's love for Rhett, the sacrifices they had both made, the pain they had endured. What will you do now? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Josie looked at him, her eyes clear and determined. I'm going to stay here, she said. I'm going to rebuild the ranch. I'm going to honor Rhett's memory. She knew that it wouldn't be easy, that she would face challenges, that she would be alone. But she was no longer afraid. She had Rhett's love, his memory, his spirit. And she had a new purpose, to live a life worthy of his sacrifice, to find her own redemption. The unforgiving truth had been revealed, but in its wake, a new path had emerged, a path towards healing, towards acceptance, and towards a future she would build on her own terms. Chapter 19. Redemption Song. Josie sold the dry goods store Arthur had so proudly owned, using the money to pay off the debts on the Callahan Ranch and begin the long process of restoration. The townsfolk of Harmony Creek, initially wary and judgmental, slowly began to accept her, to respect her resilience, her strength. They had heard the stories, of course, the whispers of her escape, of the shootout in the desert, of Brody's death. They had seen the change in her, the quiet determination in her eyes, the unwavering spirit that had replaced the meek submission of her former self. Some remained hostile, clinging to their prejudices, their judgment. But others, particularly the women, saw in Josie a reflection of their own hidden strengths, their own unfulfilled dreams. They saw a woman who had dared to defy convention, to choose love over security, to live life on her own terms. Josie worked tirelessly, rebuilding the ranch, restoring the land, reclaiming her heritage. She hired help, former ranch hands who had been loyal to her father, men who respected her grit, her determination. She often thought of Rhett, of his love, his sacrifice, his memory. She kept his journal close, reading his words, drawing strength from his spirit. She also thought of Caleb, of his loyalty, his courage, his untimely death. She wished she could have known him better, that she could have thanked him. One day, while cleaning out the old barn, she found a box, a small, wooden box filled with letters. They were letters from Caleb, letters he had written to a young woman in a neighboring town, a woman he had loved. Josie read the letters, her heart aching with each word. She discovered a young man full of life, of dreams, of hope. She discovered a young man who had loved deeply, who had been loved in return. She decided to deliver the letters, to give the young woman, Sarah, a measure of comfort, a piece of Caleb's heart. She rode to the neighboring town, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. She found Sarah, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, working in her family's bakery. Josie introduced herself, her voice hesitant but determined. She explained who she was, who Caleb had been, and what had happened. Sarah listened, her eyes filled with tears, her heart breaking with each word. She had known that Caleb was in danger, that he lived a risky life. But she had loved him, despite the risks, despite the uncertainty. Josie handed her the box of letters, her hands trembling. He loved you very much, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Sarah took the box, her fingers tracing the faded ink, her tears falling onto the worn paper. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thank you for bringing me this. Josie stayed with Sarah for a while, sharing stories of Caleb, of his bravery, his loyalty, his love. They found comfort in each other's grief, a shared understanding of loss. As Josie rode back to the ranch, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. She had honored Caleb's memory. She had given his love a voice. She realized that redemption wasn't just a place, a hidden valley in the mountains. It was a spirit, a hope, a song. It was the song of second chances, of forgiveness, of love. It was a song that she would carry in her heart, a song that she would sing for the rest of her days. The ranch, once a symbol of loss and burden, was now becoming a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of the human spirit, and to the possibility of finding redemption, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years passed. The Callahan Ranch thrived, a testament to Josie's hard work, her determination, and her unwavering spirit. She had rebuilt the house, restocked the herds, and restored the land to its former glory. She had become a respected member of the community, a woman known for her strength, her resilience, and her compassion. She had never forgotten Rhett, his love, his sacrifice, his memory. She kept his journal close, reading his words, drawing strength from his spirit. She often visited his grave, the simple wooden cross overlooking the vast expanse of the desert, a place of peace and reflection. She had also kept in touch with Sarah, Caleb's young love, offering her support, friendship, and a shared understanding of loss. They had become close, like family, bound by the memory of a young man who had touched both their lives. One day, a stranger arrived at the ranch, a young man with familiar eyes that reminded her of Rhett. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a quiet demeanor. He introduced himself as Miguel, a distant cousin of Rhett's, from his mother's side. Josie welcomed him, her heart filled with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. She invited him inside, offering him food and drink, listening to his story. Miguel had grown up in Mexico, hearing stories of his infamous cousin, the outlaw Rhett Slade. He had always been fascinated by Rhett's life, by his legend. He had come to Texas to learn more, to find his roots. Josie told him everything about Rhett's life, his love, his sacrifice, his death. She showed him Rhett's journal, his letters, the evidence of his true character. Miguel listened, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. He had never known Rhett, but he felt a connection to him, a kinship. He was a good man, Miguel said, his voice filled with emotion. He lived a hard life, but he had a good heart. Josie nodded, her eyes filled with tears. He did, she said. He was the best man I ever knew. Miguel stayed at the ranch for several weeks, helping Josie with the work, learning about the land, and becoming a part of her life. He was a kind, gentle young man, with a strong work ethic and a quiet strength. Josie grew to appreciate his company, his friendship, his connection to Rhett. He reminded her of Rhett, not just in his appearance, but in his spirit. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fiery orange and deep purple, Miguel turned to Josie, his expression serious. "Josie," he said, his voice low and hesitant. I have something to tell you." Josie looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She sensed that this was important, that it was a moment of truth. Miguel took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. I know about Sheriff Brody," he said. "I know what happened." Josie's heart skipped a beat. She had never told anyone the full story, not even Thomas. She had kept the secret of Brody's death, the violence of her actions, locked away in her heart. How do you know?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miguel explained that he had met one of the former posse members, a man who had been present at the shootout in the desert. The man, haunted by guilt and remorse, had confessed everything to Miguel, telling him the truth about Brody's death, about Josie's role. He said you were brave," Miguel said, his voice filled with admiration. "He said you were a force of nature." Josie looked away, her eyes filled with tears. She had never thought of herself as brave, as a force of nature. She had simply done what she had to do, to survive, to protect the man she loved. I didn't want to kill him," she said, her voice choked with emotion. But I had no choice. Miguel reached out, taking her hand. I know, he said. You did what you had to do. You protected yourself. You avenged Rhett. Josie looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw understanding, compassion, and acceptance. She saw a reflection of Rhett's spirit, of his love. It was the final confrontation, not of guns and violence, but of hearts and horizons. It was the moment when the past, the present, and the future converged, when the truth was finally revealed, and when healing could begin. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Thank you for understanding. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge, one by one, filling the vast expanse of the night sky. Josie felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. She had faced her demons. She had found redemption. She had lived a life filled with love, loss, and ultimately, triumph. The final confrontation had brought not destruction, but a profound sense of release, a confirmation of the strength she had found within herself, and a reaffirmation of the enduring power of love, a love that had shaped her life and would continue to guide her across the horizons of her future. Epilogue. The years that followed were kind to Josie. The Callahan Ranch prospered, becoming a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of redemption. She became a legend in her own right, a woman who had defied the odds, who had loved fiercely, and who had survived. Miguel remained at the ranch, becoming like a son to her, carrying on the Callahan legacy and honoring Rhett's memory. He married Sarah, Caleb's young love, uniting two families, two stories, two legacies. They had children, filling the ranch house with laughter, with life, with love. Josie often sat on the porch, watching the sunsets, remembering Rhett, his smile, his touch, his unwavering love. She kept his journal close, reading his words, drawing strength from his spirit. She never remarried, her heart forever belonging to the outlaw who had stolen her away, the man who had shown her the true meaning of love. She lived a long and full life, surrounded by family, by friends, by the legacy she had created. She had found peace, she had found happiness, she had found redemption. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a breathtaking tapestry of color, Josie sat on the porch, her old body frail but her spirit unbroken. She felt a gentle breeze, a whisper of wind, a familiar presence. She closed her eyes, a smile gracing her lips. She knew. It was time. She saw him then, Rhett, standing before her, young and handsome, his eyes filled with love. He reached out his hand, his touch gentle and familiar. Josie, he whispered, his voice a caress. It's time to come home. She took his hand, her heart filled with joy, with peace, with a love that had endured the test of time, the trials of fate, the scars of yesterday. She stood up, her old body transforming, becoming young and vibrant once more. She walked with Rhett, hand in hand, towards the setting sun, towards eternity. The ranch house stood silent, bathed in the golden light of the fading day. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a song of redemption, a song of love. It was a song that would echo through the generations, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to the triumph of love over adversity. And as the stars emerged one by one, filling the vast expanse of the night sky, Josie and Rhett were finally together, their love story complete, their journey at an end. Their spirits, forever intertwined, soared above the ranch, above the desert, above the world, free at last, and forever home.